Being a stepmother is challenging, but being cheated out of your inheritance is devastating. My late husband's children convinced me he left everything to them, but when I discovered the real will hidden in his office, their lies unraveled in the most satisfying way. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here we are. My name is Victoria, and 3 years ago, I lost the love of my life, my husband David, to a sudden heart attack. What I didn't lose, apparently, was my naive trust in his adult children, a mistake that cost me dearly. David and I had been married for 8 wonderful years. When we met, I was a 42-year-old widow running a small interior design business, and he was a 52-year-old divorced architect with 2 grown children, Marcus, 28, and Sophia, 25. From the beginning, his kids made it clear I was an unwelcome addition to their family. They tolerated me at best, openly resented me at worst, but David was convinced that time would heal all wounds. "They just need to get to know you," he'd say, pulling me close. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and they'll see that eventually." I tried everything. I invited them for holidays, remembered their birthdays, even helped Marcus with his job interviews, and gave Sophia decorating advice for her first apartment. But every gesture was met with cold politeness or outright dismissal. Still, David was so happy, and our marriage was so strong, that I learned to live with their chilly reception. David was incredibly successful. His architectural firm had designed several landmark buildings in our city, and he'd invested wisely over the years. We lived comfortably in a beautiful home he'd designed himself, complete with his spacious office where he'd spend hours sketching and planning. He always joked that his office was his sanctuary, and I respected that space, rarely venturing in except to bring him coffee or dinner when he worked late. The night David died, I was in complete shock. One moment we were watching a movie together, the next he was clutching his chest, gasping for air. The paramedics tried everything, but it was too late. The man who had filled my life with laughter and love was gone, just like that. In my grief, I barely functioned. Marcus and Sophia, to their credit, handled the funeral arrangements. I was grateful. I couldn't have managed the details in my state. But looking back now, I realized they were positioning themselves from the very beginning. 2 days after the funeral, Marcus asked to speak with me privately. "Victoria," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I know this is hard, but we need to discuss Dad's will. He had everything drawn up years ago, before you two were married. I'm sorry, but he left everything to Sophia and me." I stared at him in disbelief. "That can't be right. David and I talked about updating his will after we married. He said he was taking care of it." Sophia joined us then, her eyes red from crying, or so I thought. "I'm sorry, Victoria, but Dad never changed anything." The lawyer confirmed it. "The house, the business, the investments, it all goes to us. But don't worry, we're not heartless. You can stay in the house for 6 months while you figure things out." 6 months. They were giving me 6 months to grieve my husband and rebuild my entire life. But I was so devastated, so overwhelmed by loss, that I couldn't even think straight. When they showed me what they claimed was David's will, dated 7 years earlier, I barely glanced at it. The legal language was confusing, and I was drowning in grief. I trusted them. God help me, I actually trusted them. The next few months were a blur of pain and practical concerns. I downsized to a small apartment, using what little savings I had. My design business suffered as I struggled to concentrate. Marcus and Sophia were efficient in their takeover of David's assets. They sold the house within 4 months, to a developer who promptly tore it down. They liquidated his investment portfolio and took control of his architectural firm. Occasionally, one of them would call to check on me, their voices dripping with false sympathy. "We know Dad would have wanted us to look out for you," Sophia said during one such call. "He always said you were special to him." The way she said special made my skin crawl, but I was too broken to fight back. I spent the first year in a haze of depression, barely keeping my business afloat. It wasn't until I started therapy that I began to think clearly again. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, was the one who first suggested something might be wrong. "Victoria," she said during one of our sessions, "you've mentioned several times that David talked about updating his will. Are you absolutely certain he never did?" That question haunted me for weeks. David was meticulous about everything, his work, his finances, his relationships. It seemed completely out of character for him to promise something so important and then never follow through. But what could I do? The will had been probated, the assets distributed. It was too late, wasn't it? Then came the phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson? This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh and Associates Law Firm. I was David Patterson's attorney. My heart stopped. I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. Marcus and Sophia told me their father used Hartwell and Sons for his legal work. There was a long pause. Mrs. Patterson, I handled all of your husband's legal affairs for the past 15 years, including updating his will 18 months before his death. I've been trying to reach his children for 3 years, but they've never returned my calls. I was hoping you might help me understand why the will I prepared was never submitted for probate. The room started spinning. What did you say? Your husband created a new will in January, 2 years before he passed. You were named as the primary beneficiary, with provisions for his children as well. I have the original document in my office. Mrs. Patterson, are you there? I could barely speak. I need to see that will. The next day, I sat in Jennifer Walsh's office, staring at a document that shattered my world, and rebuilt it at the same time. David's real will, witnessed and notarized, left me the house, 60% of his business, and the majority of his investments. Marcus and Sophia were each to receive substantial trust funds, more than enough to set them up for life, but they weren't the primary heirs. But how is this possible? I asked, my hands shaking as I held the papers. They showed me a will. It was probated. Jennifer's expression was grim. What they showed you was likely David's old will, the one I helped him replace. Somehow, they managed to submit that one for probate instead of this one. Mrs. Patterson, this is fraud on a massive scale. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. For 3 years, I had lived in near poverty while David's children enjoyed the inheritance he had meant for me. They had looked me in the eye, pretended to care about my welfare, all while knowing they had stolen everything David wanted me to have. But Jennifer wasn't finished. There's more, Mrs. Patterson. Your husband left specific instructions about where he kept important documents. He mentioned a hidden safe in his office, behind the bookshelf. Did his children ever mention finding such a safe? They hadn't, of course. That evening, I called Marcus. Victoria, what a surprise, he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending concern. How are you holding up? I need to ask you something, Marcus. When you cleaned out your father's office, did you find a safe? The pause was telling. A safe? No, I don't recall seeing one. Why do you ask? He was lying. I could hear it in his voice, the same careful tone he'd used when explaining why I couldn't inherit anything. I was just wondering about some of David's personal papers. Things that might have sentimental value. Oh, well, we boxed up most of his personal stuff. It's in storage if you want to look through it sometime. More lies. I was sure of it now. The next morning, I drove to the house where David and I had been so happy, or rather, to the empty lot where it had once stood. The developer who'd bought it was someone I'd worked with professionally, and after some persuasion, he agreed to let me search the construction debris. It was a long shot, but I had to try. 3 hours of searching through rubble and broken wood yielded nothing. But then, buried under a pile of twisted metal and concrete, I found it, David's safe, damaged but intact. The combination was our wedding anniversary, of course. Inside, I found copies of the Real will, along with a letter addressed to me. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I suspect my children have not been honest with you about my final wishes. I've hidden this safe and these documents because I know Marcus and Sophia better than they think I do. They've never accepted you, and I fear they might try to circumvent my will if given the chance. The will Jennifer Walsh prepared is my true testament. You are my wife, my partner, the woman who brought joy back into my life after years of loneliness. Everything I've built, I want to share with you. My children will be well cared for, but you are my priority. I hope you never have to read this letter. But if you do, please know that you were the greatest gift of my later years. Fight for what's rightfully yours. I know you have the strength. All my love. David. I sat there in the rubble of our former home, clutching David's letter, and cried. Not just from grief, but from a rage so pure it burned through 3 years of depression and self-doubt. The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. Jennifer Walsh was a formidable attorney, and the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus and Sophia had not only hidden the real will, they had actively concealed it from the probate court. They had committed fraud, and now they were about to face the consequences. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating finally came when Jennifer served them with papers demanding the return of all fraudulently obtained assets. They called me within an hour. Victoria, we need to talk, Marcus said, his previous confidence completely gone. There's been a misunderstanding. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. Both of them looked haggard, older than their years. The mask of false concern they'd worn for 3 years had finally slipped. "We can explain everything," Sophia began, but I held up my hand. "No, you can't. I found David's real will. I found his safe. I found his letter." I watched their faces drain of color. "I know exactly what you did." Marcus leaned forward desperately. "Look, we can work this out. We'll give you a fair share." "A fair share?" My voice was deadly quiet. "You mean the 60% of your father's estate that he legally left to me? Or maybe you mean the house you sold out from under me? The investments you liquidated? The 3 years of my life you stole while I struggled to survive?" Sophia was crying now, real tears this time. "Please, Victoria. We were angry. We felt like Dad replaced our mother with you. We weren't thinking clearly." "You weren't thinking clearly for 3 years? You watched me lose everything and said nothing for 3 years." I stood up, my composure finally cracking. "Your father loved you both despite your treatment of me. He left you each trust funds worth more than most people see in a lifetime. But that wasn't enough, was it? You had to have it all." Marcus grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. "What do you want from us?" "We'll do anything." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then met his eyes. "I want what your father intended me to have. Every penny, every asset, every single thing you stole. And then I want you both to live with the knowledge that your greed cost you the only parent who ever truly loved you unconditionally." The legal resolution took 6 months. Marcus and Sophia were forced to liquidate assets to repay what they'd stolen, plus interest and legal fees. They had spent lavishly during their 3 years of ill-gotten wealth. Expensive cars, luxury vacations, Marcus's failed restaurant venture, Sophia's designer wardrobe. Getting the money back required them to sell nearly everything. The trust funds David had set up for them were still there, of course. He had been generous even when providing for their potential betrayal. But those funds were now tied up in legal restrictions that would prevent them from accessing the principal for years. I used part of my restored inheritance to buy back David's architectural firm from the partners who had acquired it from Marcus and Sophia. The rest I invested wisely, just as David had taught me. My interior design business flourished again, and I found myself busier and more successful than ever. But the most satisfying moment came 8 months after the settlement, when both Marcus and Sophia reached out to me separately, asking for loans. Marcus needed money for his daughter's college tuition. Sophia was facing eviction from her apartment. I met with each of them, one final time. "I want you to understand something," I told Marcus as he sat across from me in my office, hat in hand. "Your father set up those trust funds because he loved you. He wanted to make sure you'd never want for anything. But your greed blinded you to his generosity." To Sophia, I was more direct. "You spent 3 years watching me struggle while you lived in luxury with my money. Now you want my help? You want me to save you from the consequences of your own actions." Neither received a loan from me. But I did something else, something I think David would have approved of. I used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in his name, specifically for students studying architecture or design who came from difficult family circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on me that his children, who had tried so hard to erase my place in his life, would now watch his memory live on through a foundation that bore both our names. 3 years later, I've rebuilt not just my finances, but my life. I've remarried, a wonderful man named Thomas who knew David professionally and admired him greatly. We live in a house I designed myself, filled with furniture and art that David and I collected together. Marcus and Sophia have slowly begun to rebuild their own lives, though we have no relationship. I occasionally hear updates through mutual friends. Marcus found work with another firm. Sophia went back to school. They're surviving, which is more than they allowed me to do during those 3 dark years. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about being so hard on them. After all, they argue, they were grieving too. They lost their father. But here's what I've learned. Grief doesn't excuse betrayal. Love doesn't justify theft. And family, whether by blood or by choice, should lift each other up, not tear each other down. David's letter sits framed on my desk now. Reminder that love endures even when those who should honor it choose not to. His children learned too late that their father's generosity came with expectations of decency and honesty. When they chose greed over grace, they lost far more than money. They lost the chance to honor the man who raised them and loved them despite their flaws. As for me, I learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the strength to fight for what's right, even when the people who should support you are the ones trying to tear you down. David always said I was stronger than I knew. It just took losing everything